Chapter 4, China and Japan, 1912 to 1945. This chapter considers the very different histories of China and Japan between 1912 and 1945. It analyzes on the one hand the disintegration of China as a unified state and the competing efforts made to restore Chinese power by the Kuomintang and the Communists, which led to periods of civil war. On the other hand, it looks at the rise of the Japanese Empire, its efforts to subdue China, and its ambitions in the Southeast Asia, which eventually brought it into conflict with the ultimate defeat by Britain and the USA. What were the implications of the warlord era, which affected China? 1916 to 1927, 4.1. For Chinese statesmen seeking to modernize the strength and strengthen the Chinese Republic, the warlords posed a major challenge, which was not overcome until Communist China was established in 1949. The warlords were, in effect, independent rulers who could thwart efforts by the central government to reform the state. Individually, they could be defeated, but the central government lacked the resources to overthrow them all and to create a strong, united Chinese Republic. The Revolution and creation of the Chinese Republic, 1911. In the decade after the defeat of the Boxer revolts, the pressure for reform and change in China grew even more powerful. Chinese intellects increasingly looked to Japan as an example of an East Asian state that was modernizing successfully and could stand up to the Western powers. Chiang Kai-shek, the future leader of the nationalist China, for example, studied military strategy in Japan. It was in Japan, too, that Sun Yat-sen formed the United League, Tamagaki, whose policy of the three principles of the people was eventually to become the inspiration of Chinese nationalism. In November 1908, both the emperor and the real power behind the throne, the Emperor Dowager Cixi, died. As the new Emperor Puyu, who had been appointed by Cixi on her deathbed, was only 2 years old. China was governed by his father, Prince Chun, who acted as regent. Chun sacked the modernizer General Yuan Shikai and formed a deeply unpopular and unrepresentative clan cabinet. Not surprisingly, this was to meet mounting opposition throughout China in 1911. The city of Wuhan and 7 provinces in southern China declared their independence of the empire. Initially, China was divided. In the south, a republic was formed under Sun Yat-sen, with its capital in Nanjing, while in the north of Beijing, the empire still existed. Yuan Shikai had been recalled by Chun with instructions to defeat the revolution, but under pressure from the provincial army commanders, Puyu was forced to abdicate, and the Chinese Republic, which claimed to represent the whole of China, was declared. Sun Yat-sen handed over the presidency to the experienced soldier and politician Yang Shiki. Issues facing China: Yuan Shikai and the disintegration of China. Yuans, like Sun Yat-sen, aimed to bring about a revival of Chinese power and to do for China what the Meiji Restoration did for Japan after 1868. His failure to achieve this indicates the scale of the problems facing a Chinese government anxious to centralize and reform a disintegrating China. He and his successors faced formidable challengers. The countryside was poverty-stricken, land prices were dropping, farmers were hit by inflation, and absentee landlords were driving up rents. Hundreds of thousands of peasants were also rendered homeless by floods and droughts, which led to the formation of secret societies and revolts. Between 1896 and 1911, there were, for instance, 353 insurrections throughout China. In the cities, bad conditions led to strikes and riots, and it was only in the territory controlled by the foreign concessions that modern industry could flourish independently of the Chinese government. The Republic also faced a chronic shortage of money. The provincial governments retained money which should have gone to the central government in Beijing, and inefficient collection of taxation only yielded about a third of what it should have. There was a pressing need for the Beijing government to extend central control over the provinces, but poor communications made this difficult to achieve. In Sushan, for example, the local gentry were able to ensure that official posts went only to those born in the province, while in the province of Guangdong, Haman and Qingjunmen were able to draw up independently of Beijing their own reform programs. Neither could Beijing rely on the loyalty of the army. After China's defeat by Japan in 1895, new armies had been created, but their loyalty was to their commanders rather than to the government. Yang Sheki in power, 1912 to 1916. Once appointed president of China in 1912, Yuan attempted to centralize power in Beijing. He held elections for a national parliament, but when the newly formed Kuomintang Party won, he had its most active campaigner, Song Jaro, assassinated and the party banned in 1913. A year later, he changed the constitution so that there were no limits to his terms of office. He also made enemies of the local gentry and the provincial military commanders by attempting unsuccessfully to abolish China's historic provinces and to replace the Republic's armed forces under a central military command. Nor was he able to solve China's financial problems. The financial situation continued to deteriorate, and the annual budgets were works of fiction that bore no relation to reality. The only way to solve the problem was to negotiate foreign loans, but these came at a high cost to Chinese independence. In April 1913, Yuan raised a loan of 110 million pounds with a consortium of 6 European nations, but this involved the creation of a new audit office headed by a European official whose agreement the Chinese government had to seek before sending any money. These policies failed to unite or rejuvenate China and stirred up intense hostility among patriots and radicals. In 1913, in what was called the Second Revolution, 7 provinces declared their independence but were defeated by loyalist troops, causing Sun Yat-sen, who was now highly critical of Yuan, to flee to Japan. Unrest rumbled on, and some revolutionaries joined the Citizens' Punitive Army, which carried out a guerrilla campaign in central China until it was defeated in 1914. Yuan's restoration of the empire with himself as emperor in December 1915 led to the formation of the anti-monarchy army in southern China. Yuan, ill and lacking support from the northern generals who had up to now been loyal to him, had already decided to abdicate just before he died in June 1916. Power shifts to the warlords, 1916 to 1920. The 4 years ending in the 5-day war in July 1920 were a period of accelerating chaos for China. Governments in Beijing could only remain in power with the support of the northern generals, who were increasingly divided among themselves. The key figure during this increasingly anarchic period was the commander of the Beiyang army, Prime Minister Duan Quri. But his attempts to overcome provincial rivalries and centralize China were opposed by the warlords. A reconciliation conference in Shanghai aimed at overcoming the divisions between Duan and the warlords failed, and in July 1920, General Zhang Zhulun of Manchuria and Wu Prefei of Hunan, in what became the 5-day war, forced Yuan to flee for protection to the Japanese concession in Tangji. As the historian Jonathan Fenby, 2008, has pointed out, the Zhang Wu victory launched the full warlord era that had been brewing since Yuan Shiqi's death. The warlords. Arguably, the independence of the warlords and the need to subdue them were the greatest problems facing Yuan and his successors. The warlords acted like sovereign monarchs and ruled their territories they controlled as if they were their own kingdoms. They raised taxes, negotiated loans from foreign bankers, and waged war on negotiated alliances with other warlords. Above all, they had their own armies composed of their followers and sometimes strengthened by mercenaries. By 1925, the warlord armies totaled some 1.5 million men. Whichever warlord temporarily controlled Beijing controlled the central government. Not surprisingly, between 1960 and 1928, there were 26 prime ministers. However, no warlord was strong enough to control China by himself, and so China became what was effectively a patchwork of independent territories, each controlled by an individual warlord. The warlords. The most important warlords during the period 1916 to 1927. Zhang Zuolin, 1875 to 1928, of Manchuria, the old marshal, who had initially been a bandit and controlled of some 300,000 square miles of northeast China. Thanks to Japanese investment, Manchuria was one of the more wealthy areas of China, and consequently Zhang attempted to remain on good terms with the Japanese. However, after his defeat by the KMT in 1928, he was assassinated by the officers in the Kwangtung army, who hoped that this would provoke Zuolin's army into taking action against the Japanese and so provide them with an excuse to annex Manchuria. Zhang Zongchang, 1881 to 1932, of Shandong, the so-called dog-meat general, had also been a bandit chief, but after being defeated by his rivals, he sought protection from Zhang Zuolin. He became an effective military strategist who had particularly good use of armed trains. In 1925, he conquered Shandong, but 3 years later, he was forced to seek Japanese protection after being defeated by KMT forces. Yan Zixing, 1883 to 1960, controlled Shanxi province from 1911 to 1949. Unlike many of the other warlords, he attempted to modernize and build up its industry. Feng Yuzhen, 1882 to 1948, the son of an agricultural laborer who had converted to Christianity. In contrast to most of the other warlords, he had no territorial base. In 1924, he turned against his main ally, Wu Peifu, and enabled the KMT to seize Beijing. Wu Peifu, 1874 to 1939, controlled a large area of central China, and for a time the government in Beijing. In 1927, he was defeated during Chiang Kai-shek's northern expedition and forced to retreat into the interior of Henan. In the province of Guangxi, power was exercised by the three-man Guangxi group, which made considerable efforts to modernize the province. Its forces played an important role in the northern expedition, but the three warlords broke off relations with Chiang Kai-shek, who defeated them in 1929. After relations with Chiang Kai-shek, the Japanese occupation of Manchuria and invasion of China, the Guangxi group again cooperated with the KMT. In Zhejiang, an extensive and predominantly Muslim territory in the west of China, Yang Zhengzhen, 1864-1928, ruled quite independently of Beijing. He supported the restoration of the empire and was so hostile to Bolshevik Russia and communism that he actually banned the construction of factories, as these would lead to the growth of a radical working class. One of the most savage of the warlords was Ma Fuxing, 1864 to 1924, who served as commander under Yang Zhengzhen. He controlled the area around Kashigar, one of the westernmost cities in China, and claimed the region's oil and mineral rights as his personal property. He would kill his enemies by feeding them into a hay-making machine. In the end, Yang Zhengzhen had him executed and his dead body tied to a crucifix for his former subjects to mock and violate. Some warlords, such as the Guangxi group, provided a stable government for the provinces they controlled, but they were in a minority. It was quite common for undisciplined warlord troops to work with bandit gangs to terrorize and rob the population. Some of these gangs were small groups, others could number as many as 10,000. Often bandits would cooperate with the warlords, or warlord soldiers might become bandits. Secret societies such as the Red Spear Society and the anti-Christian Big Sword Society were formed, which attempted to protect the villages from the ravages of the bandit and the warlords. However, the sheer size of China ensured that there were considerable areas that were left untouched by the warlords. Business and industry throve in Manchuria and in foreign concessions in Shanghai and Guangzhou, for example. Elsewhere, however, the picture was much bleaker. Unemployment in the countryside was estimated to be around 87 million. The transport infrastructure was primitive, and after the end of the First World War, the trade deficit grew annually. As the Washington Conference in 1922, the Western powers and Japan were ready to assist China to reorganize its finances, but they would not commit themselves to a detailed plan until an effective central government had been formed. As we shall see in the next section, the creation of an effective government that could unify China was exactly what the Chinese nationalists and the young radical wished to bring about by defeating the warlords and reclaiming the foreign concessions for a new, strong, modern Chinese state. Reasons for and impact of the May the 4th movement. Mao Zedong later claimed that he was the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, that it was the workers who had founded the May the 4th movement, and at this point took over the leadership of the Chinese Revolution. This claim, to quote the historian Jonathan Fenby, was utter nonsense. The movement, whose intellectual powerhouse was Beijing University, was a result of the frustrations and desire for reform of young Chinese intellectuals who looked with despair at the state of their country. The movement's members were intent on modernizing China and inspired students and intellectuals with the message that China needed to get rid of its Confucian pact and embrace the values of the modern Western world: democracy, welfare, and equality for both sexes and all nations, which were summed up by Sun Yat-sen's 3 principles. It sought to replace the old Chinese culture with the most advanced Western ideas and supported the equality of the sexes and female liberation. One leading member, the academic Chen Duxi, argued that what China needed was a Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy to enable it to compete with the West. It was the widespread protests in Beijing on May 4th that led to the formation of the May the 4th movement. Young Chinese nationalists were incensed that in 1919 the former German concessions in Shandong were to be given to Japan rather than returned to China. Japan, after all, had sent no troops to France, while China had sent 100,000 laborers to the Western Front. In Beijing on May 4th, some 3,000 students rioted in protest against the decision and beat up a former Chinese ambassador to Tokyo. The following month in Paris, Chinese students surrounded the hotel where the Chinese delegation were staying in order to prevent their country's diplomats from going to Versailles to sign the treaty. Impact of the movement. By the early 1920s, some of the movement's members hoped that a Chinese equivalent of Mustafa Kemal, the Turkish leader, or even Gandhi in India, would emerge and to lead China. Others, like Chen Duxi, looked to communism. Bolshevik Russia quickly exploited this and sent agents to help organize the new party. In 1921, the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, held its first Congress. Among those who attended was the future communist ruler of China, Mao Zedong. Although the movement stood little chance against the power of the Chinese warlords, its ideals would help transform Chinese society and culture in the coming decades. Reasons for the growth of the Kuomintang Party under Sun Yat-sen. As provincial president of China in 1912 and the head of the KMT administration in Guangzhou in 1923, Sun Yat-sen had proved to be an ineffective politician and was known as Sun the Windbag among the merchants in Canton. Nevertheless, for all his inadequacies, he became the symbol of Chinese nationalism, and his three principles, which were formulated in 1905, its slogan. After his death in 1925, he became a legendary figure whose ideological legacy seemed to offer China the chance of escaping what Jonathan Feibe called the warlord jungle. Sun Yat-sen in the Nationalist Republic of Gansu. In 1919, Sun refounded the Kuomintang KMT, and 3 years later he returned to Gansu together with his military advisor Chiang Kai-shek. The control of the warlords and former revolutionary Chen Joiming, who initially welcomed Sun to use Gansu as his base. Chen Joiming was himself a reformer. He tightly controlled military expenditure, and Chen Duxiu, one of the key figures in the May the 4th movement, was in charge of education, which was allocated 20% of the government's budget. Sun's aim was to use Guangdong as a base for which to launch a military expedition in an ambitious attempt to unify China. In this, he anticipated the intention of Chiang's northern expedition of 1926, but instead of advancing over land with overwhelming force, he organized small flotillas of boats on the rivers leading towards northern China. The 1922 expedition was to prove a complete failure. Sun retreated back to Guangzhou, where he quarreled with Chen and to save his life had to escape to Hong Kong. However, with money from expenditure Chinese in the USA, he was able to stage yet another comeback. He exploited Chen's growing unpopularity in Guangzhou, which was caused by ever-increasing taxes, and paid a mercenary army to drive him out of the city. In February 1923, together with Chiang, he returned to the city and formed a new government. Sun left the day-to-day administration to Chen Duxiu and his colleagues and concentrated on spending the doctrine of the three principles, which the KMT in January 1924 adopted as its guiding ideology. Sun became the KMT's life president. Sun's priority was still to defeat the warlords. Achieve this, he optimistically hoped that he would be able to gain the support of the Western powers. In December 1923, in apparent contradiction to his nationalist convictions, he even suggested privately that the USA, Italy, Britain, Germany, and France should occupy the main cities in China. Then, after national elections had been held, they would gradually revert back to Chinese control. Once the Chinese were capable of self-government, the suggestion was rejected and practicable by the Western powers, who had no desire to be sucked into the complexities of Chinese politics. Sovereign aid to the Kuomintang. Like the Western powers, the USSR also refused to intervene militarily to defeat the warlords. Nevertheless, it offered to send two advisors with the code names Borodin and Galin to organize the KMT along the lines of the Russian Communist Party and to form a modern army based on the Soviet model. He hoped that this would strengthen Soviet influence in China. At the KMT Party Congress in January 1924, Sun agreed to model the KMT along Soviet lines. This ensured that essentially in an undemocratic party dictatorship was created which dominated the Gansu government, but Sun was careful to limit Soviet influence as he had no intention of the KMT becoming a communist party. Communists were therefore allocated only 10 out of 41 seats on the Central Executive Committee, but they did heed the influential organization department, and in 1926 a communist Mao Zedong, the future communist leader of China, took over the propaganda department. Creation of the National Revolutionary Army. Galin played a key role in advising Chiang on the formation of the National Revolutionary Army, which after 1928 was simply known as the National Army. Galen optimistically believed that a small, well-trained army modeled on the Soviet Red Army would rapidly defeat the warlords. A military academy was set up on Wampum Island, just outside Guangzhou, under Chiang, to train the officers for the NRA. In 1925, Chiang, who was appointed commander-in-chief of the NRA, also made sure that it was politically independent of its Soviet advisors. Chiang Kai-shek became head of the KMT. Chiang was dismissed by his rivals in the KMT as a soldier with no experience of the intricacies of the civilian government. However, this was seriously to misjudge his political skills. His control of the NRA gave him a unique position in Chinese politics, which enabled him to become the leader of the KMT and ultimately of nationalist China. Initially, after Sun's death in March 1925, the national government of the Chinese Republic was proclaimed in Gaza under Wang Jingwei. Yet Chiang, as the head of the newly formed NRA, rapidly emerged as the real power in the city, as was shown by the events of the summer of 1925, when he had in quick succession to defeat a mutiny by mercenary troops, keep order in Guangzhou at a time of strikes and demonstrations against the foreign concessions, and then defeat an attempt by Chiang Jikming to reoccupy the city. Chiang's success ensured that he now became part of the triumvirate together with Wang and Borodin, the Soviet political advisor, which now controlled Guangzhou. In March 1926, Chiang skillfully exploited the absence of Borodin in northern China and the onset of Wang's diabetes to strengthen his position. He removed key communist officials, including Mao, from their positions and allegedly, for their own good, put the Soviet advisors into protective custody. Borodin, on his return, had no option but to accept Chiang's coup d'etat, and Wang fled to France. The KMT in 1926 poised to go on the offensive. Since being refounded in 1919, over the next 7 years, the KMT developed into a formidable political and military force. Sun Yat-sen may well have been an ineffective politician and an even worse military leader, but his role in building up the KMT was of key importance. By 1923, Sun had secured Guangzhou, one of the wealthiest cities in China, as a base for the KMT and set up a republican government there. He failed to gain support from the West, but accepted advisors from the USSR. He accepted much of their political and military advice, but made sure that the KMT would not become dominated by them. He also agreed to keep the elite military school for officers at Wampum under the leadership of Chiang in 1924, with the express aim of strengthening the KMT as a revolutionary nationalist force. These officers were to become the leaders of the NRA, which was founded in 1925. Above all, Sun's three principles became the official ideology of the KMT, which potentially enabled it to appeal to a wide cross-section of Chinese opinion. Sun, to quote historian Jonathan Fenby, 2008, was the figurehead round which the regime in Guangdong province and Kuomintang supporters elsewhere in China gravitated. By March 1926, both the KMT and NRA were controlled by a single individual, Chiang, and together formed the strongest force in China, the Northern Expedition. The Northern Expedition was a determined attempt to destroy the warlords and unify China. Chiang did succeed where Sun had failed in fighting a brilliant campaign, as the North China Daily News observed. The KMT achieved amazing things. No longer were the northern warlords the dominant force in China. At the cost of 25,000 casualties, the KMT won control of half a million square miles and 170 million people. but Chiang's very success led to major splits in his government and also attempts to eliminate the communists, which eventually escalated into full civil war. The KMT gave Chiang full command of the military expedition, the aim of which was to carry out Sun Yat-sen's ambition of unifying China by advancing north and wiping out the power of the warlords. On the face of it, the northern expedition seemed an over-ambitious plan. The warlords had far larger armies, the financial resources of KMT were limited, and space in Guangzhou was still in a state of turmoil as a result of labor unrest. Despite his coup, Chiang also had bitter critics within the KMT who mistrusted his dictatorial tendencies. On the other hand, Chiang did have some major advantages over the warlords. The KMT was a dynamic political force with an ideology which potentially attracted all those who wanted to see a strong modern China, such as nationalists, Democrats, communists, modernizers, liberals, businessmen, and financiers in Shanghai. The NRA was well organized and trained and generously supplied with equipment by the USSR. The communist wing of the KMT was able to win the support of the peasants to turn them against the warlords by promising land reform. Chiang also appealed to many of the enemies of the central and northern warlords, such as Tang Xingzi, a former regional commander, and Huan, who had been defeated by allies of Wu Peifu. The successful advance from Canton to Wuhan, July to October 1926. In 3 months, the KMT achieved impressive success and first defeated the warlord Wu Peifu and his allies in Huan, and then advanced northwards towards Wuhan, which was captured on October 10, 1926. The KMT administration and Borodin, the Soviet advisor who had now moved up from Guangzhou to Wuhan, advised Chiang to advance further northwards and capture Beijing. Chiang, however, preferred to capture Nanjing, as it was where Sun Yat-sen had proclaimed the First Chinese Republic in 1912, and then moved on to occupy the wealthiest city of Shanghai. The NRA and its allied forces now numbered some 260,000 soldiers, among whom there was a particularly effective female group, the Dare to Die unit. Led by Canton's Joan of Arc, Chiang advanced eastwards into Jiangxi, where he met stiff opposition from the local warlords Sung Chuanfang, and victory was only assured after Galen drew up new plans for a counter-offensive with air support. On December 18th, the NRA seized Fuzhou, the capital of Fuyang. Later, the CCP would claim that it was the communists who had achieved these successes. Certainly, there were communist-inspired peasant uprisings and in-place worker strikes. In Shanghai and Huan, for instance, workers' organizations expelled Wu Peifu's forces, yet in the final analysis, it was a combination of the NRA's military power and Chiang's bravery of the warlord generals, persuading some of them to defect to the KMT that was decisive in his military successes. Preparations for the advance to Nanjing and Shanghai. In his preparations for the advance, Chiang showed himself to be as much part of the warlord culture of his times as representative of a new liberal China. This can be seen in the way he dealt with the threat to the KMT posed by the communist trade unions in Shanghai. The unions were opposed by the communist trade union. The unions were planning to exploit the chaos that would follow the initial liberation of the city by the NRA to set up a Soviet which would effectively rule the city. To counter this, Chiang was offered support by pockmarked Huang, the most powerful figure in Shanghai's underworld, in exchange for giving him a free hand to develop his business in prostitution. the opium trade, and gambling, an offer, as we shall see below, he later accepted. He was also advised by his wife, H. Kong, the financial and industry minister in the KMT government in Wuhan, that if he did not gain the support and protection of the Shanghai businessmen, he would be assassinated by the communists. To win their support, Chiang agreed to appoint H. Kwong to the post of prime minister and marry his wife's younger sister, Su Meiling. He advanced to Shanghai and Nanjing, January to March 1927. In the first months of 1927, the NRA advanced steadily towards Nanjing and Shanghai. Opposition from the dog-meat general Zhang Zhongshan, who controlled the province of Shandong, was broken in early March, and it was now only a matter of time before both cities fell to Shang. Yet, just as he was on the brink of success, the civilian government in Wuhan attempted to subject him to stricter control, accusing him of being a dictator. After a momentary failure of nerve, Shang decided that he could best defend himself by stepping up the pace of his advance. He won the support of key officials and regional commanders of the dog-meat general through bribery, which allowed his troops to advance unchallenged further down the Yangtze. He also eliminated potential communist opposition by allowing his soldiers to execute any CCP members who fell into their hands. The situation in Shanghai on the eve of occupation by the KMT. With relations between the communists and nationalists rapidly deteriorating, the strong communist influence in Shanghai represented a considerable threat to Shang. In theory, the Shanghai communists were allies, but in reality they had their own aims and wished to set an independent Soviet in the city. When Shang's forces approached Shanghai, 2 general strikes broke out in quick succession, involving some 100,000 workers, in an attempt to undermine the dog-meat general's defenses of the city. To ensure the strikers' defeat, Shang delayed his advance until the warlords had defeated the first strike and executed hundreds of workers. When the second general strike broke out, Shang agreed to the plan that he had already discussed with Pokemar Tong, a private army formed by the gangland boss Du Yoshig, would suppress the strike before the nationalists reached the center of the city. The fall of Shanghai and Nanjing, March 1927. Little resistance was offered to the 3,000 NRA troops under General Bai. When they advanced into the southern suburbs of Shanghai on March 18th, the dog-meat general's soldiers put up no resistance and tried to escape to the foreign concessions. The following day, the Nationalist Sixth Army entered Nanjing. Again, the warlord's army broke and its soldiers looted, raped, and burnt as they fled. Shang had indeed won 2 great victories, but their consequences were to inflame the divisions within the KMT between the communists and nationalists, as we shall see in the next section. How effectively did Chiang Kai-shek deal with the communists in the period 1927 to 1936? 4.2. The communists presented a major challenge to Chiang, as they were subtle political opponents who did not hesitate to change their tactics when this was required. Essentially, they were opportunists. If they saw a chance to seize power, they would take it, but equally they were able to take the long-term view and work towards a revolution that might take a decade or more to achieve. On the other hand, compared to the battle-hardened nationalists led by Chiang, they lacked an effective army, and during the decade 1927 to 1936 were several times on the verge of complete defeat by his forces. They were saved from elimination by the fact that Chiang faced other enemies, the warlords and the Japanese, as well as challenges within the KMT. The Shanghai massacres and extermination campaigns. When NRA troops liberated Shanghai from the warlord Shang Zhongshan, Chiang feared an immediate challenge. A general strike had been called, and it was feared that the CCP would form a Soviet and seize power. In anticipation of this, foreign communists flocked into the city. Tension was further raised when a raid on the USSR's legation in Beijing in early April not only resulted in the arrest of several Chinese communists, but also the seizure of documents which apparently revealed plans for a communist revolution in China. Chiang's response to these threats had already been prepared. On April 12, 1927, nationalist soldiers and the militia, formed by the Shanghai gang leader Big Ears Du, attacked the communist strongholds and shot and bayoneted on the streets anyone suspected of being a communist. Altogether, between 5,000 and 10,000 people were killed in Shanghai. The White Terror rapidly spread to the neighboring regions Hangzhou, Hunan, and Guangzhou. The consequences of the massacres. The massacres failed to crush the communists and started in the long term, to quote the historian Jonathan Fenby, 2008, a violent power struggle between left and right that would take millions of lives in 22 years of national dislocation. The Shanghai massacres also intensified the split between the KMT and Wuhan. Chiang was expelled from the party and denounced as a counter-revolutionary, while the policy of the United Front with the communists was affirmed. The policy was, however, rejected by Stalin, who drew the conclusion from the Shanghai massacres that the CCP should build up an independent Red Army and effectively take over the KMT. This decision was to weaken the CCP still further and to play into Chiang's hands. It paved the way for two wings of the party to unite and to accept Chiang as its leader. The CCP was weakened even further by attempting to carry out Stalin's instructions for a more aggressive policy. Uprisings in Nanjing and the port of Santu were rapidly defeated in July 1927. In December, again on Stalin's orders, the communists rose up in Guangzhou, but were ruthlessly crushed altogether. Some 5,700 communists or alleged communists were murdered. The KMT broke off relations with Moscow and closed Soviet legations and officers in China, which ensured that no money reached the CCP. The year 1927 was a disastrous one for the CCP. According to the CCP source nearby, 38,000 communists had been killed. The chance of the party's survival were also not helped by the advice they received from Moscow. Galin and Borodin had been both replaced by new advisors, and the CCP was firmly under Soviet influence. Its leaders Lysen and Zhao Enlil were based in Shanghai. Li, following the example of the Russian Bolshevist Party, imposed an iron discipline on the CCP, rebuilt the Red Army, and argued that the party should concentrate its efforts chiefly on the cities. Here the leadership was obediently following the orthodox Marxist belief that revolution would start in the cities. In fact, the CCP was at its weakest in the big cities, where it was persecuted by the KMT and its gangland allies. The Long March, 1934 to 1935. The key to the survival of the CCP during the years immediately after the Shanghai massacres was the creation of the 12 rural bases in remote regions in the countryside and the mountains of southern Hubei. For example, 200 communist partisans fortified a small area which later expanded into the largest base of EU1 and were able to recruit thousands of local peasants made desperate by bad harvests and heavy rain. In southeast China, Mao himself set up a base in the mountains of Jiangxi. So while the Long March was unique in scale, it was in fact following earlier precedents to escape elimination. The CCP could only survive by withdrawing to remote areas where nationalist troops would find it difficult to to subdue them. Between 1930 and 1934, nationalist pressure on the CCP intensified. Its organization in Shanghai was smashed in 1931, and many leading communists were killed. Chiang also planned a further major campaign against the CC bases, but at the last moment his attention was distracted by the Japanese occupation of Manchuria in September 1931. A year elapsed before he could resume his campaign with an attack on the EU-1 base. This was so effective that to survive, the communist forces led by Zhang Gato had rapidly to evacuate EU-1. In an operation that anticipated the Long March, they set up a new base in the security of the remote region of Shangwan. Ironically, Mao, who was later to use similar tactics with the Long March, denounced Zhang for running away, accusing him of warlordism and flightism. One reason for this accusation was that Zhang was one of his political rivals for the control of the party. In 1933, Chiang's campaign against the communists was again interrupted when the Japanese occupied Zhou, and it was not until he negotiated a ceasefire with them, the Tangyu Truce of May 1933, that he was free to continue his campaign against the CCP. This time, the nationalists launched a well-prepared attack on the Zhengzhi base. A blockade cut off its food supplies, new roads were built for the movement of nationalist forces, and some 150 planes were deployed. By the end of September 1934, Chiang's troops were poised to overrun the base, and the Zhengzhi Soviet came to the conclusion that the only option for the Red Army was to find a safer and even more remote base. It was this quest that was to become the Long March. The Long March lasted for a year and covered some 5,000 miles. The initial chances of it succeeding were not high. The participants had to traverse a hostile terrain interrupted by mountain ranges, rivers, and swamps, defend themselves from superior nationalist forces, which inflicted frequent defeats on them, guerrilla attacks from warlords, disease, starvation, and the bitter cold in winter. Somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 men, women, and children began the march in October 1934, and only about 10,000 reached Yinan a year later. The history of the march rapidly became the great epic story of Chinese communism and was used as evidence that the CCP, and particularly its leader Mao, possessed a heroic strength which would ultimately overcome all its enemies. Why was it that against all the odds, March succeeded and that Chiang was unable to capture Mao and the other communist leaders? Chiang's allies, the warlords, could not be relied upon at a crucial moment in his campaign against Mao. Some withdrew from their cooperation right at the beginning of the march. For instance, the local warlord, the governor of Guangdong, allowed the communists to slip around the ring of blockhouses which had been constructed by nationalists to keep them penned in, and moved on to Gazing. Chiang's operations were also sometimes disrupted by bad weather, which enabled the Red Army to escape defeat. For example, the nationalists won the Battle of Guoyang in February 1935, but thanks to rain and cloud, which prevented the effective deployments of air power, Mao and the survivors again escaped and made the Yunnan province, where they were helped by the warlord Long Yu to move on and cross the Zhengzhi. Chiang again had a good chance of destroying the communist forces as they crossed the turbulent Daju River in Shiyun province in May 1935. Communist propaganda was later to spread the myth of an epic victory there, but recent historians have concluded that it was only a minor skirmism because the main part of the nationalist army failed to arrive on time. However, the crucial point is that the Red Army was once again able to escape, and on June 12, 1935, to join up with Zhang Gusto's Soviet in northern Sichuan. And Mao, Chang had a ruthless opponent who knew what he wanted, and during the march was able to neutralize his critics in the party and enforce his will over the party. Chiang also faced a constant threat by the Japanese Kuomintang army in Manchuria to control northern China. This distracted him from his campaign against the Red Army at crucial moments. The Xi'an incident. Despite reaching Yian, the CCP was not yet safe from further nationalist attacks, but then its position was unexpectedly strengthened when General Chiang Kai-shek was kidnapped in Xi'an in December 1936. How did this extraordinary turn of events happen? Chiang accused of appeasement. In Yian, Mao skillfully played the patriotic card and argued that the KMT government was appeasing Japan and not defending China from Japanese aggression. In fact, Chiang was seeking to prepare China for the coming war against Japan by strengthening its defenses and burying armaments in Germany and the USA. But all this had to be done secretly for fear of provoking Japanese retaliation. Consequently, Chiang could not openly refute Mao's accusations, which increasingly won support both from Chinese patriots and Chiang's enemies, the warlords. The well-known Chinese philosopher and member of the May the 4th movement, Hu Xi, described the Kuomintang as dead but not buried, and all unburied dead things cause trouble for the living. Chiang, however, was convinced that he needed to eliminate the CCP before he confronted the Japanese. Mao responded to this threat by advocating a united front composed of the CMT, CCP, and even the warlords against the Japanese, and was able to gain the support of the warlord of Sengji, Yan Zhengshan, and Zhao Zhulang of Manchuria, both of whom feared that if Chiang crushed the CCP, he would then be in position finally to reduce their power by incorporating their armies into the nationalist forces. In September 1936, the CCP signed a secret agreement with Chiang to resist Japan and save the nation. The kidnapping of Chiang and its consequences. At the suggestion of General Yang, commander of the Kuomintang's Northwest Army, who was impressed by Mao's apparent patriotism, plans were drawn up to kidnap Chiang. When he visited Jian, the provincial capital of Zhenji, in December, on December 12th, Chiang and all the KMT members accompanying him were rounded up and imprisoned. Mao, of course, was delighted and demanded Chiang's elimination and trial by a people's court. But here he was overruled by Stalin, who believed that Chiang was the best man to lead China in a war against Japan. Chiang was therefore released, and instead a united front between the KMT and CCP was formed. Chiang's release and the creation of the United Front were received with relief by many Chinese, who were convinced that the Japanese threat required national unity. The United Front saved the CCP from possible elimination, as Chiang could hardly now go ahead with his plans for sending a military expedition to Yian. Attempts at modernization and reform. Briefly, between 1928 and 1930, it seemed that Chiang would be able to modernize and reform China, but these hopes proved to be a mirage as Chiang struggled to defeat the CCP and prepare for eventual war against Japan. Chiang reappointed head of the Kuomintang government. After the left wing of the KMT, which was based in Wuhan, decided to cut its links with the communists in July 1927, the two wings of the KMT reunited. Initially, the reunited party hoped to form a government without Chiang, who was forced to resign and withdrew to his ancestral home. Yet in December, after the failed communist uprising in Guangzhou, in response to calls for a strong leader, Chiang was reappointed head of the KMT. He launched a second stage of the northern expedition and conquered both the province of Shandong and the old imperial capital of Beijing, but Chiang broke with tradition and kept his government in Nanjing with the establishment of the United Nationalist Administration in Nanjing. It seemed momentarily as if China would at last be able to modernize and reform itself. Chiang won the support of the intellectuals, many members of the May the 4th movement, key businessmen, and even some of the warlords. The communists seemed to be marginalized. The new government and administration. Chiang, as chairman of the State Council, created in 1928 a new blueprint for China's government, which was now to consist of 5 departments, or yuan, which controlled the business of government. The closest approximation to a parliament was the legislative yuan, which had the power to debate and approve legislation, national budgets, and foreign policy. It was, however, an unelected body, which initially had only 51 members, later increased to 194, who were appointed by the government and not chosen in free elections by the people. Despite frequently referring to Sun Yat-sen's 3 principles, Chiang was more of a dictator who sought to rule through the KMT rather than as a democrat. The 5th yuan, for instance, was called the control yuan. Its task was to enforce discipline and obedience to the ideology of the KMT, which was entrusted to rule on behalf of the people until 1936, when elections would be held for a new government. In practice, the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937 ensured that this period was extended indefinitely. A party dictatorship was established, which attempted, despite the fragility of the KMT regime, to impose its regime on the country. There were tight controls on the press, education, and the arts. The political police, backed by the blue shirts, conducted a reign of terror against dissidents, especially communists. Economic, social, and financial reforms. In the early years of the KMT, ambitious plans for financial reform, agricultural improvements, and industrial expansion were launched. A central bank was created. Attempts were made to standardize weights and measures and taxes, while a National Reconstruction Commission was formed to build power stations and oversee the modernization of the economy. There were a series of reforms which, had they been effective, would have undermined support for the communists. An 8-hour working day was introduced, and workers were to share in the profits made by their employers. Child labor was prohibited. Foot binding was to be banned. Traditional Chinese custom whereby young girls' feet were tightly bound to control their growth. Small feet were considered a mark of beauty. Healthcare and education were to be greatly expanded. Civil servants were to be given higher salaries in an attempt to eliminate corruption by government officials. In practice, these ambitious reforms were impossible to implement. Despite Chiang's victories, China was still a deeply divided state, and several warlords, despite Chiang's victories, managed to retain considerable independence. Chiang could defeat an individual warlord, but he lacked the power to eliminate them completely and so create a uniform modern state. The money and time that was spent on military operations against the communists and defiant warlords meant that there were neither the financial resources nor the time to concentrate on effectively building a modern China. Thus, in 1935, for a population of 450 million, there were only 30,000 hospital beds, and just 500,000 children attended schools. Some progress was made in the development of modern coal and iron industries, but overall, only between 1.5 and 2 million workers were employed in modern factories. In the countryside, which was a fertile recruiting ground for the CCP, relatively little had changed since the beginning of the century. The majority of farmers used the traditional methods of cultivation, and in 1933, for example, the average farmer income was less than his outgoings. They were too burdened with heavy taxes, much of which were embezzled by the tax collectors, and those who grew tea, tobacco, or silk crops were at the mercy of monopolies run by big businesses or large landowners. It is not surprising, therefore, that the British economic historian R.H. Tanway compared the life of the typical Chinese peasant to a man standing permanently up to his neck in water so that even a ripple is sufficient to drowning him. Why did the Chinese Communist Party gain support up to 1945? 4.3. Although the Long March and the Xi'an incidents saved the CCP immediate destruction, it was still in considerable danger from the nationalists. The situation, however, was transformed by the large-scale invasion of China by Japan, which resulted in war that lasted until 1945. Mao was able to expand the Yunnan base into the provinces of Gansu and Naxai, even though its borders remained under constant surveillance from the nationalists. It was here, as we shall see below, that Mao was able to set up in comparative security the Ying Soviet. The Red Army was also greatly expanded to 184,000 soldiers by 1938 and now consisted of a force in Shaanxi, the 8th Army, and the newly formed 4th Army in the lower Zhengzhou. Results of the Long March and the leadership of Mao Zedong. During the Long March, Mao was able to defeat two challenges to his position. In January 1935, an England meeting of the Politburo was called to hold an inquiry into the disasters that had befallen the CCP over the last few years. Mao successfully led the criticism directed at Baogu, the head of the CCP, and Zhao Enlai, the political leader in charge of the army. He won the argument and emerged in a much stronger position. He joined the standing committee of the Politburo, and one of his close political allies, Lo Fu, replaced Bo as political leader. In June, Mao saw off another challenge when he met up with Zhang Guotou, his former leader of the EU Wan base. After crossing the snowy mountains, Zhang's 4th Army was larger and better equipped than Mao's 1st Army. He had a strong claim to become the leader of the combined force, but Mao managed to sideline him as deputy chairman of the military commission. Zhang ceased to be a threat after his defeat on the Upper Yellow River by the nationalists in the autumn of 1935. Even though Mao was the most powerful figure in the CCP leadership by the end of 1935, he still faced considerable criticism within the party from a large group of Russian-trained Chinese communists who had returned to Yian with orders from Stalin to enforce the orthodox communist teachings that revolution can only occur in the big cities. To combat these arguments, Mao, with the help of a brilliant intellectual, Shane Boda, learned to master Marxist philosophy and argued that in China it had to adjust to Chinese reality, where peasants made up 88% of the workforce. Mao managed to defer the meeting of the 7th Communist Party Congress, which could have overridden his decisions until 1945, by which time, with Boda's assistance, he had developed the Mao cult. Through propaganda at every level, he was portrayed as the great leader. He became chairman of both the Communist Central Committee and the Politburo. Establishment of the Yian Soviet land reform and Mao's reflection campaign. In the decade between 1935 and 1945, Mao was able to turn the Yian base into a Soviet, which in many ways provided a blueprint for how the communists would rule China if they gained power. Above all, Mao was able to put into practice his belief that the Chinese Revolution would start in the countryside by modernizing the peasantry. Units of the Red Army fanned out from Yuan to occupy the countryside. Landlords were evicted and often mercilessly killed. The soldiers were given strict instructions not to behave like warlord troops and plunder the peasantry. Land was then shared out among the peasantry and local Soviets set up. Literacy and education programs were introduced and basic medical services provided. The rectification campaign. In many ways, Mao's policy of confiscating land from the landlords was effective in increasing the population of the CCP, which increased its numbers from some 700,000 to well over a million by 1945. However, dissenters and critics of Mao were not tolerated. Villages which did not want to join the Soviet had all their crops and livestock seized and were subject to punitive taxation reminiscent of the worst of the warlords. Similarly, anyone who questioned Mao's interpretation of Marxism or his peasant policy was rapidly marginalized from the party. Mao particularly directed his attention against party intellectuals who had been trained in Moscow and who questioned both his authority and policies. A rectification campaign was therefore launched against those guilty of subjectivism, by which was meant those who did not agree with Mao's interpretation of Marxist Leninism; sectarianism, by which anybody who did not agree totally with and obey the authority of the Central Committee was guilty of party formalism. This referred for the most part to intellectuals who could not communicate with the people in a way that could be understood. Intellectuals who had joined the Union Soviet after the Long March were denounced at party rallies and subject to terror. In the autumn of 1942, a cadre screening movement was organized by Mao's political police in Yin, allegedly against nationalist bias, but by December it was widened to include anybody who dared deviate from the official party line, and now called a rescue movement. Those rescued from error had the chance under torture to rectify their mistakes. By the time the rectification campaign had halted, some 40,000 people had been expelled from the party. Its main purpose was achieved. Mao had eliminated anybody who did not agree with him and had created a centralized, obedient revolutionary force, which after 1945 was to be highly effective in defeating the nationalists. Impact of the war with Japan, 1937 to 1945. War between China and Japan broke out in August 1937 after the Marco Polo Bridge incident. It rapidly escalated into a prolonged and savage struggle, which involved terrible incidents like the Nanjing massacres by Japanese troops and the destruction of the Yellow River dikes by the nationalists, which resulted in the drowning of 500,000 people. By December 1941, when the USA declared the war on Japan after Pearl Harbor raid, much of eastern China was occupied by Japan, yet so long as the nationalists and communists were ready to fight, it was a war with which Japan could not win. The western provinces remained unoccupied, and even the occupied areas were impossible effectively to police. Neither side was able to win outright, and over 1 million Japanese soldiers were tied down in China until the dropping of atom bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the USA forced Japan to surrender. China paid a high price for victory. Some 14 to 20 million Chinese were killed. As the historian Rana Mitter, 2014, observed, the war had hollowed China out. In the eastern part of the country, its cities were in ruins and agricultural lands had been destroyed by the scorched earth policies practiced by both sides, so that much of the population faced starvation. Inflation, too, had ruined the currency. Above all, China emerged from the war with Japan still a deeply divided country. It now faced a massive escalation of the conflict between the nationalists and communists. Impact of the war on the CCP. Paradoxically, the war saved the CCP from destruction by the nationalist forces, a point that Mao was to make when the Prime Minister of Japan visited China in 1972. It was on the nationalists that the main burden of the war fell, even though there was some limited fighting between the Japanese and communists. Whenever possible, Mao sought to avoid conflict with the Japanese and continued to view Shang as his main enemy, even though, of course, CCP propaganda lost no opportunity to claim that it was the true patriotic party and was doing most of the fighting against the Japanese. In fact, in 1940, Mao hoped that the USSR and Japan would cooperate to divide China along the Yangtze nearby, and enabling the CCP to control half the country. Mao also cultivated links with Japanese intelligence in the hope of sabotaging the nationalist war effort. Despite the agreement to establish a united front with Shang for the duration of the war with Japan, conflict between the nationalists and Japan and communists did continue. For instance, in January 1941, large-scale fighting broke out between the Communists' Fourth Army and the Nationalists in the lower Yangtze region, which resulted in the defeat of the former. Thanks to Mao's strategy of avoiding conflict, the CCP emerged in 1945 much stronger than it had been in 1937. It had established control over large areas of northern China and was well placed to make contact with the Russians when they declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. It had an army of nearly 1 million supported by an additional flotilla about 900,000 strong, while party members was over 1 million. It was recognized by both the USSR and USA as a strong political movement that would play an indispensable role in the future of China. In 1944, for instance, US set up a mission in Yan'an to liaise with Mao. Unpopularity of Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang. With the surrender of Japan in 1945, Chiang had won the war in China, but this victory did little to ensure the popularity of his regime. The Kuomintang was unable to appeal either to the bored mass of the Chinese people or to the intellectuals and the liberals. In an effort to unite the country, he set up a National Political Consultative Council in July 1938. But even when it was reformed in 1943, it proved, as the historian Jonathan Fenby, 2008, observed, mere window dressing for his own power and was not able to provide a focus for national unity. Neither was Chiang able to mitigate the impact of the war on the Chinese people. Indeed, his tactics often intensified their hardship when, for example, he ordered the dikes on the Yellow River to be blown. He displaced some 6 million people, possibly killing 500,000. The war caused a constant stream of refugees who, at the state was unable to feed them, were sometimes reduced to eating tree bark or even to cannibalism. The army had first claim to the food supplies in Heian, for example, which experienced severe drought in 1942. The army requisitioned between 30 and 50% of its merged food supplies. As a result of the huge areas lost to the Japanese, Chiang had little option but to increase taxes and to inflate the currency. By 1941, soldiers' wages were 78% lower than they had been in 1937. It was no wonder then that soldiers would often plunder the peasantry and steal their food and property as if they were bandits or warlord troops. Besides, they were often conscripted, ill-disciplined soldiers who on marches to the front had to be roped together in case they deserted. Neither did the defeat of Japan in August 1945 bring any relief to the population. The government had nothing new or inspiring to offer the citizens or the intellectuals. Instead of a democratic New Deal, a virtual police state came into being. Communists and liberals were arrested and strikes broken up. Industry and the transport infrastructure had suffered greatly from the war, and there were no funds to rebuild them. In the countryside, landlords were able to extract rents and payments from the peasantry at will. If payments were refused, private militias or even KMT troops were used in retribution. In the newly liberated areas, profiteers and swindlers swarmed in to exploit the helplessness and the misery of the population to make money. Corruption and the black market existed everywhere. Blood plasma made available by the American Red Cross was sold in shops at Shanghai and everywhere else. Inflation tipped over into hyperinflation in Shanghai. For instance, the cost of living index was 900 times higher than it had been in 1937. Above all, by the end of 1945, China was again engulfed in the civil war between the communists and nationalists. With the nationalists unable to reform and unite the nation, it was no surprise that increasingly the Chinese came to accept the Mao. Why did Japan become a military dictatorship in the 1930s, and with what consequences? 4.4. This section looks at the history of Japan from the end of the First World War until its attack on the American base at Pearl Harbor in December 1941. It was a period in which increasing tensions developed both within Japan and between Japan and the Western powers and the USSR. Japan's international status in 1919 and its reaction to the Paris Peace settlements. When Japan attended the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 as a member of the victorious coalition, which had defeated Germany, and the USA and the European allies were unsure whether Japan counted as a great power. Modern Japan had only emerged as a major power in the early 12th century. By 1919, it had the world's third largest navy as well as a formidable army, which had been able to defeat Russia in 1905. Its military strength was also complemented by its economic strength. Between 1895 and 1920, its GDP had nearly trebled, and the output of mining and manufacturing had increased by almost 6 times. On the other hand, it was still essentially a regional power interested in expanding into Korea, Manchuria, and China. In the First World War, it had concentrated on seizing the German concessions in Shandong in China and the small German North Pacific Islands, and refused to send troops to Europe. To Asian nationalists, Japan was an inspiration and an example. The country had managed to modernize itself. It was both able to resist Western imperialists and, as the Anglo-Japanese Treaty of 1902 showed, even cooperate with them as equals and negotiate alliances with them. Yet by 1919, Japan's very success made Britain and the USA increasingly apprehensive of the growing Japanese economic and military power in the East Asia. Military circles in both Japan and the USA were uneasily aware of a possible future confrontation between the two powers. The Japanese Navy, for example, saw the possession of the German North Pacific Islands as the key to blocking a future U.S. advance into the area. Despite its strength, Japan, as an Asian power, experienced considerable racial prejudice by practically the English-speaking powers. Britain, the USA, and the White Dominions, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. U.S. politicians, for instance, were worried about the impact of possible Japanese immigration on California and the West Coast. The Japanese were sufficiently concerned to fear, in the words of the one Japanese elder statesman, a white alliance against the yellow peoples. Japan's reactions to the Paris peace settlements. Japan came to Paris to achieve certain specific aims: to retain the former German concessions of Shandong, to establish control over the former German islands in the North Pacific as far as possible, to cooperate with Britain and the USA and support the 14 points. It was lukewarm about the establishment of the League of Nations, as it feared that it might be an attempt, as the historian Margaret Macmillan 2001 had put it, to freeze the status quo and to keep Japan in the second rank. If Japan could not delay the League's creation, it would insist on the insertion of a racial equality clause into the League's constitution. The Japanese retained Shandong and the former German Pacific Islands, even though they were made mandates under the League of Nations, but the racial equality clause was rejected by Britain as a result of pressure from New Zealand and Australia. The reaction of the Japanese press to this was highly critical. Count Makino Nobaki warned the USA and the Allies that this might cause Japan to lose faith in the League. Sadly, he was correct, and Margaret Macmillan's 2001 opinion, The failure to get the racial equality clause was to be an important factor in turning Japan away from cooperation with the West and towards more aggressive nationalistic policies, political and economic factors in the failure of democracy. As the historian Mary Hanman, 2001, observed, during the 1920s, Japan was poised between the promise of greater democracy and the threat of greater control by the government. By 1930, Japan enjoyed some of the characteristics of a democracy, but the impact of the Great Depression was dramatically to strengthen the anti-democratic forces, such as the army and patriotic societies. Political developments during the 1920s. In 1918, it seemed as if a new kind of party politics was emerging with the formation of two new political parties, the Shanghai Association of Political Friends and the more liberal Kansai Constitutional Association, and yet successive governments backed by both groups still failed to democratize Japanese politics. Harakai, the leader of the Shanghai, did manage to open up some political posts to members of his party, but he was too dependent on the House of Peers and the Genro to consider any serious constitutional reform or to extend the suffrage. It was Kato Takaki, the leader of the Kansai, who agitated strongly for the introduction of representative government on the British model. In 1924, he won an election fought on the issue, and in 1925, he introduced the Universal Suffrage Act, which gave the vote to all males over 25. The act did not, however, signal the start of a more liberal regime. It only became law because the Diet, which was under pressure from conservative and nationalist pressure groups, such as the Koashona National Foundation Society, passed the Peace Preservation Law. This sweeping outlawed any organization that dared demand changes in Japan's imperial constitution or an end to private property. In 1928, when the first election was held under the new franchise, the Prime Minister Takagaki used the Peace Preservation Law to make over 1,000 arrests and dissolve three left-wing parties. Clearly, therefore, fear of communism and socialism provoked a reaction from the nationalist right and the government, which did much to stop the development of an effective democracy in Japan in the 1920s. The impact of economic factors on the failure of democracy. Between 1923 and 1931, Japan suffered a series of economic crises, all of which triggered anti-democratic reactions from the government. In September 1923, the Kanto earthquake devastated Tokyo and killed over 100,000 people. The large sums needed to recover from this disaster led to inflation and the weakening of the banking system. In 1927, the Japanese banking system was in crisis as the banks had huge debts they could not cover. This led to the collapse of more than 20 banks in an economic recession. These crises inevitably had political repercussions and fueled political protests from left-wing groups, whom the government ruthlessly tried to suppress. In May 1928, as we have already seen, over 1,000 arrests were made and a permanent police surveillance system was set up. The economic impact of the Great Depression, 1929 to 1931. Japan had hardly recovered from the 1927 recession when its economy was hit by the Great Global Depression of 1929, which was triggered by the collapse of the U.S. stock market. Its impact was made more disastrous by the return of the yen to the gold standard in June 1929, which drove the price of Japanese exports up to uncompetitive levels. The total value of exports fell from 2,513,000,000 yen in 1929 to 1,426,000,000 in 1931. The textile trade was particularly severely hit as Japanese exports to the USA almost dried up. By 1930, the price of silk had fallen by 80% compared to 1925. Inevitably, this was a devastating blow for farmers whose incomes dropped by 2/3. The political impact of the Great Depression. Rural Japan was the seed boat of the militarism and nationalism that was to dominate Japan up to 1945. The peasants' bitterness and belief that their misery and poverty were not understood by big businesses, and the politicians were exploited by the various right-wing pressure groups, such as the Imperial Reservists Association, for who the countryside and its inhabitants embodied the traditional virtues of Japan. Economic despair fueled the growth of nationalism and militarism, and increasingly it was to the army that the victims of the Great Depression looked to reform Japan and restore its ancient warlike virtues. The growth in ultra-nationalist groups. Ultra-conservatives in Japan and Japanese nationalists accepted that to defend itself against Western imperialism, Japan had itself to industrialize and to model itself in many ways on the West, but by doing this, it ran the risk of losing touch with its own ancient traditions. To reconcile the ancient and the modern, Japanese patriots looked to the army to achieve victory on the battlefield and the domination of East Asia. This, they believed, would restore national pride in Japanese traditions and also make Japan prosperous. By 1936, well over 500,000 Japanese belonged to ultra-nationalist organizations. It was these which were to mobilize mass support for the army's expansionist policies in China and weaken the government's ability to control the armed forces. Implications of military rule for Japanese expansionism. After 1930, the influence of the army and navy in Japanese politics increased to the point where effectively they controlled Japan. They never created an actual dictatorship, but they had the power to veto government policies and bring about the dismissal of ministers they considered hostile to their interests. The military, both in Tokyo and in China and Manchuria, was the driving force behind Japanese expansionism. Attempts to bring about the Showa Restoration. Ultra-nationalist ideas were particularly strong in the army among junior officers who were influenced by the ideas of Kitai Ikki for a Showa restoration. By assassinating corrupt civilian politicians, they would destroy what they regarded as decadent democracy and restore the power of the emperor. The Showa restoration failed, but the 5 plots against the government and assassinations of its members, 1931 to 1936, nevertheless succeeded in strengthening the power of the armed forces over the government. In 1931, there were 2 unsuccessful attempts by the nationalist Shakuraki of Cherry Blossom Society to assassinate the prime minister and install General Ugaki, the war minister, as the head of the new government. On May 15, 1932, members of the Ketsu Maiden, or Blood League, who were predominantly young peasants, cooperated with military and naval cadets in a plan to destroy the government and declare martial law. Although they assassinated the prime minister, they failed to achieve a military government. Instead, a cabinet of national unity was appointed. In August 1935 and February 1936, fighting broke out between 2 rival groups within the army, the Koda, or Imperial Way faction, and the Tozai, or Control faction. The former believed in direct action to bring about the Showa restoration, while the latter believed that this was a distraction from preparing for an all-out war against China. The Koda was comprehensively defeated in 1936 when the Navy, the key military authorities, and Emperor Hichiro himself all turned against its plotters. The Army and Japanese expansion, 1931 to 1937. The constant threats by ultra-nationalist officers against the government made it increasingly difficult for ministers to control the army. Even though they knew in advance of the Kuomintang Army's plans to occupy Manchuria in September 1931, they were unable to stop them, as the army simply ignored instructions from Tokyo. The plots of October 1931 and May 1932 failed, but nevertheless they intimidated the government into supporting the Kuomintang's army policy in Manchuria and recognizing the creation of the Japanese-dominated state of Manchukuo. The government now had no option but to defend the army's conquest of Manchuria in the League of Nations, even though they had not planned it, as Mary Hanman, 2001, stresses. From this point forward, the military had effective control of foreign policy. When the incident of Macro Polo Bridge just outside Beijing occurred in July 1937, the Japanese cabinet was divided about how to react, but the War Ministry, backed by the Senior General Staff Officer and the Chief of Military Affairs Department, were ready to escalate hostilities. In the end, despite cabinet divisions, the Japanese government issued an ultimatum to China demanding the withdrawal of Chinese troops back to the KMT territory within 24 hours. But before the time limit had elapsed, the Kuomintang army launched a full-scale attack on the Japanese and began the 8-year war against China. Reasons for involvement in the Second World War. The root cause of Japan's involvement in the Second World War was the bitterness of many conservatives about Western imperialism. It was this that had forced Japan to modernize and industrialize, and so to lose touch with its historic roots. Nor, once it had done this, did the West greet Japan as an equal. At the Paris Peace Conferences, it refused to have a racial equality clause inserted into the Constitution of the League of Nations, and in 1924, U.S. Congress passed the Exclusion Act, limiting Japanese immigration to the USA. To Japanese statesmen such as Kono Fumimaro, the Western powers seemed hypocritical. They had, through conquest, built up their own empires in the 9th century, yet they were stopping Japan from creating its own empire in China. No wonder, in Mary Hanman's 2001 words, Japanese nationalists viewed the West's criticism designed merely to protect the West's global hegemony. Japan's plans for a new order in East Asia and the U.S.'s reaction. On November 11, 1938, the Japanese Prime Minister Kono proclaimed Japan's ultimate intention of creating the new order in East Asia. Under Japanese leadership, this would form a large trading bloc from which the Western powers were to be excluded. It was this aim that was ultimately to cause war with the USA. To the US government, it was an article of both faith and practical economics that America should be able to trade and invest freely. Washington thus responded to each fresh extension of Japanese power not only by building up its naval forces in the Pacific, but by restricting more and more tightly the exports of potential war materials to Japan, a measure which in fact only intensified the Japanese drive for economic self-sufficiency. The USA also agreed to extend financial aid to Chiang Kai-shek's government. Japan and the USA consequently seemed therefore to be on a collision course. The impact of the war in Europe, 1940. In September 1939, Britain and France had declared war on Germany when German troops invaded Poland. Hitler rapidly defeated Poland, and then in May 1940 turned west to defeat France, occupy the Netherlands, and force the evacuation of the British army at Dunkirk. These events in Europe inevitably weakened the position of the European powers in Southeast Asia and strengthened the hand of the hawks in Tokyo, who advocated for the occupation of the European colonies in Southeast Asia. A relatively pro-Western government, which wished to avoid confrontation with the USA and Britain, was replaced by a more anti-Western regime, once more under Kono, which again emphasized its intention of creating a Japanese-dominated Asia and advocated closer cooperation with the victorious Nazi Germany. Washington responded by suspending exports to vital aviation fuel and lubricating oil. To neutralize growing U.S. opposition, the Japanese then tried to negotiate a four-power pact with the Axis states and the USSR. They succeeded in reaching an agreement with Germany and Italy in September. The Tripartite Pact, and they signed a 5-year treaty of neutrality with Stalin the following spring, but the German invasion of the USSR in June 1941 terminated any prospect of a grand four-power alliance against Britain and the USA. On the other hand, it did remove the threat of a Soviet attack on Japan. Pearl Harbor. In July 1941, the Japanese occupied the southern half of French Indochina, and the Americans responded by imposing a comprehensive oil embargo on Japan. The embargo confronted the Japanese with the alternative of either seeing their war machine paralyzed through lack of oil or launching within a few months at the latest a preemptive strike against their enemies. In early December, they received verbal assurance from Ribbentrop that in the event of a Japanese attack, Germany would also declare war against the USA, even though, strictly speaking, the Tripartite Pact did not commit Germany to such an action, as it was a defensive alliance only. Thus, at dawn on December 7th, the Japanese felt sufficiently confident to launch their attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Their aim was to destroy as much of the U.S. Navy as possible in the hope that a weakened USA would be ready to negotiate a compromise peace. But this was to prove a massive miscalculation, and the USA declared war, and eventually, in August 1945, after the dropping of atom bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, forced Japan to surrender unconditionally.